I was about 4 or 5 years old when the door burst open. I was standing in the kitchen, and in our kitchen we had one of those wall phones, the kind where you take the handle off the receiver, and it had a rotary dial. Remember those? Some of you don't remember those. But this one had this big, long, stretchy cord. You could actually walk clear into the living room with it and hand whoever was on the phone. But the phone rang, and my mother answered the phone, and with an ashen face handed the receiver to my father. And my father listened to the phone and discovered that his father in Texas, who I'd never met, had been killed. It was the only time in his life that I witnessed my father weeping. He packed some bags, and the door closed. Where were you in your life when the door burst open? What did you learn about it? How did that change who you are today? Job was considered to be one of the most righteous, if not the most righteous people on the planet. God was bragging about him. Things were going really well. And then the door burst open. And let me read to you what happened. One day while Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabines attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I'm the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, "Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the older brother's house when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead, and I'm the only one who has escaped to tell you." At this, Job got up, tore his robes, shaved his head, and then fell to the ground and worshipped. The things that you own tell a lot about you when the door bursts open. There's often stories of people who, after a fire or some disaster, lose all their possessions, and they talk about what's the most important to them. But it's not always what you lose that reveals who you are. Sometimes it's what you have. I wonder what it would be like if the elders came to your house and wandered through your garage, spent some time in there looking around at what was in there, and then they wandered into your kitchen and they looked through all of your cupboards. They opened your refrigerator and saw what was there. Wandered into your bedroom and looked into your closet. Looked under your bed. What sorts of things would they find? And what dust, someone said. Cobwebs. But those things tell a story of who you are and what's important to you. Those things are revealing to you. And when the door bursts open and suddenly you are confronted with those things, what do you do? How do you respond? How do you react when the door bursts open? I was 13 or 14. It was a warm summer day, and I was walking down the sidewalk outside the back of my house, our house, and the door burst open. My mother stepped out and threw a bucket of water on me, stuck out her tongue at me, and then ran back in and slammed the door. It wasn't a rare occasion at my house to have things like that happen. Sometimes when the door bursts open, you discover things about people that you never knew before. Sometimes it takes a long time to discover those things. I grew up in a house that was filled with a lot of turmoil. And my father and mother got married on the assumption that if you found someone who believed the same way that you believed, then you were meant to be together. And in some ways, they could be no different from each other than any two people on the planet. And so their life together for much of my growing up was tumultuous. And it wasn't probably until I was in my 50s that I began to grasp the reality of who my parents truly were. And before that, I think I held a lot of resentment. But I look now back at that door bursting open, and I see a woman who for many, many years stayed in bed suffering from depression. For many, many years, my father, I rarely saw him because he was at meetings. And now I come to the place where I recognize that these two people were broken, wounded people that were trying to make some sort of normalcy out of their life. And I see them in a way that I was not able to see at the time the door burst open, or many other doors that burst open. In your own life, when the door bursts open, what do you learn about yourself? What does that teach you about other people? The next time we find Job, he was sitting in a pile of ashes and the door bursts open. It was a hot summer day and he's looking across this barren landscape and he sees his 3 dear friends coming to see him. He'd lost his children, he'd lost all of his possessions. His wife had said that she said, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." That's her words of encouragement to him. He was in constant physical pain from boils all over his body, and he was sitting in the ashes mourning, scraping himself with potsherds to get the itch of the boils away. And his 3 friends come across the desert, and they do what friends do best. They sit with him for several days in silence, just providing the comfort that someone in mourning needs. Let me read the account to you. Job's 3 friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamite, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him. They set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud. They tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. They sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. I grew up in somewhat isolation because of the turmoil in my house, and I spent a lot of time by myself. And there are some positive things about that. I'm very comfortable just being by myself. But I also realize that I never learned how to make friends well. And part of that's because of the fact that I'm an introvert, and introverts tend to be a one person at a time relationally. But I think about Job in the midst of this turmoil, in the midst of this huge thing in his life, and how significant friends are. And so I ask myself, when the door bursts open in the past of my life, how important friends have been. And it reminds me not only how important friends are, but it reminds me how important it is for me to be a good friend and to be someone who's willing to just be present without necessarily solving their problems. How are you when the door bursts open? How will you be when the door bursts open? How are you when your friend's door bursts open? I was 19 years old when the door burst open. Uncle Sam was standing there pointing his finger at me saying, "Your number is up. You need to come down and I'm going to look at you and see. And I'm going to send you to a foreign country where you've never been to fight against people who never really did you any harm. And some of your friends are going to be wounded and some of them are going to die. And you may not come back." But that door closed. And when that door closed, another door burst open. And I found myself in the jungles of Ecuador, among people who loved people for no reason that I could understand, who loved people who had killed some of their friends, literally killed them in the midst of them loving them. And I watched them love these people, and as I watched them, another door burst open. But it was a door to heaven. And in that moment, I connected to God in a way that I had never connected to God before. And my life was radically changed. Where were you when the door burst open? Where will you be when the door bursts open? How will that change your life? I'm going to conclude by sharing a verse with you. So I want you to stand. It's from Revelation 3:20. And this verse actually is often misinterpreted because it is used as a verse of evangelism, but it is not a verse of evangelism. It is actually Jesus speaking to his people. He's not speaking to the world. He's speaking to his people. And he says this: "Here I am. I'm knocking on your door. Open the door. I want to come in and eat and feast with you, and you with me." Blessings.